Blood, money, and cheap cologne always smell exactly the same when crammed into a ballroom. I was just trying to survive my family's forced appearance at the Carmine Cartel's annual gala. Everyone else was busy kissing the Don's ring or posturing like rabid dogs. Meanwhile, the most powerful alpha in the room was sitting entirely alone, covering his ears, rocking slightly in a shadowed corner. No one looked at him. So, I walked across the room and offered him my hand. The air in the grand ballroom of the Continental Hotel was thick enough to choke on. It wasn't just the expensive cigars or the heavy cloying perfumes. It was the pheromones. When you put 300 mobsters in a room, the biological posturing becomes a physical weight. Alphas leaking dominance like cheap battery acid. Omegas projecting forced, sugary submission to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention. And betas sweating through their tailored suits, just hoping not to get caught in the crossfire. I hated these events. My name is Elias. My family, the Rossis, ran a modest extortion racket on the docks, small fry in the grand scheme of the city's underworld, but just relevant enough to warrant an invitation to Don Carmine's annual blood money masquerade. My father had spent the entire car ride here aggressively reminding me to keep my scent masked, my eyes down, and my mouth shut. Don't draw attention, Elias. We're here to pay respects, not make waves. I took another sip of my champagne. It tasted like brass. I stood near a marble pillar, far from the center of the room where Don Carmine was holding court. The Don was a massive man, radiating a brutal pine and copper alpha scent that commanded absolute obedience. Men lined up to kiss his cheek, to whisper their allegiances, to offer him envelopes thick with cash. But my eyes weren't on the Don. They were on the corner, about 50 feet away from the main cluster of sycophants. There was a dead zone. The room's lighting was deliberately dimmed there, and an unused velvet rope cordoned off a small alcove. Sitting on a high-backed velvet chair was a man in his mid-20s. He had dark hair, sharp features, and shoulders broad enough to snap a man in half. He wore a bespoke tuxedo, but the bow tie was undone, hanging limply around his neck, and the top button of his shirt was ripped open as if it had been suffocating him. Gabriel Carmine, the Don's only son, the heir to the largest criminal empire on the East Coast, and absolutely no one was looking at him. It was a very specific, highly practiced kind of ignoring. Men would walk past the alcove, their eyes sliding right off Gabriel, as if he were a piece of ugly furniture. I watched a low-level captain walk by, glance toward the corner, and visibly flinch, snapping his gaze back to his shoes before hurrying away. Gabriel was rocking. It wasn't a frantic motion, just a steady rhythmic sway forward and back, forward and back. His elbows rested on his knees and his hands were clamped firmly over his ears. His eyes were squeezed shut. Every few seconds his right hand would leave his ear to rapidly tap a staccato rhythm against his thigh before clamping back over his ear. He was drowning. I could see it. The noise of the ballroom, the clinking glasses, the roaring laughter, the overlapping conversations, the heavy bass of the string quartet completely out of their depth, was hitting him like physical blows. In the Mafia, weakness is blood in the water. If an alpha isn't asserting dominance, he's prey. But Gabriel wasn't prey. He was the Don's son. So the cartel adapted. They didn't attack him. They just pretended he didn't exist. They erased him to spare themselves the discomfort of dealing with an alpha who didn't fit the mold. An alpha who was violently overstimulated by the very world he was supposed to inherit. I took another sip of my drink. My stomach twisted. I'm an Omega, and despite the suppressants humming through my veins, dulling my natural instincts, I couldn't ignore the sharp, acrid scent of raw distress leaking from that corner. Gabriel's scent was completely buried under the stench of the room, but if you paid attention, it was there. Wood smoke and heavy rain, fractured and spiraling. My father sidled up next to me, checking his watch. 30 more minutes, he muttered, his eyes scanning the room. Then we make our excuses. Why is he alone? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. My father followed my gaze, realizing who I was looking at. He paled, immediately turning his back to the corner. Jesus, Elias, keep your voice down. He looks like he's in pain. He's defective, my father hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The Don's shame. The boy's brain is wired wrong. Doesn't look a man in the eye, throws fits if a room is too bright. They say he beat a man half to death last year just because the guy touched his shoulder without warning. Leave it alone. Look anywhere else. Defective. The word tasted worse than the champagne. I looked at Gabriel again. He had pressed the heels of his hands into his eye sockets now, blocking out the chandeliers. The tapping of his fingers against his temple was frantic. The room was getting louder. The Don was laughing at a joke, a booming, chest-rattling sound. Gabriel flinched, curling tighter in on himself. I set my glass down on a passing waiter's tray. "Elias," my father warned, his hand shooting out to grab my arm. I slipped out of his grip. "I'm just going to get some air," I lied. I didn't head for the balcony. I walked straight toward the dead zone. The closer I got, the more the invisible barrier around the alcove made itself known. The pheromones here were chaotic. Gabriel's distress was a physical pressure, sharp and biting. I stopped right at the edge of the velvet rope. Up close, I could see the fine tremor in his broad shoulders. He was muttering something under his breath, a rapid, repetitive string of numbers, counting a rhythm to ground himself. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. He didn't notice me. Or if he did, he didn't care. I didn't speak immediately. I knew better than to add another layer of noise to the avalanche burying him. I simply stood there, keeping my scent neutral, breathing slow and steady. I unclasped my velvet rope, letting it drop to the carpet with a soft thud. Then I took a step into the shadows. I didn't touch him. That was the first rule of dealing with an animal caught in a trap, and it applied just as well to a man drowning in his own nervous system. I stopped about 3 feet away, giving him a wide berth. The ambient noise of the ballroom felt marginally less aggressive in this corner, absorbed by the heavy drapes, but Gabriel's rocking hadn't slowed. His eyes were still shut tight. I crouched down slowly, dropping to his eye level so I wouldn't be towering over him if he looked up. My knees popped slightly. "The music is out of time," I said. I kept my voice low, dropping it to a register that vibrated more than it rang. I didn't direct the words at his face. I spoke toward the floor between us. Gabriel's rocking hitched, just for a fraction of a second. Then it resumed. He didn't open his eyes. "The cello is lagging behind the violins," I continued, maintaining that steady, flat tone. "It creates a syncopation that shouldn't be there. It's grinding against the rhythm." Gabriel's hands slowly lowered from his ears. He kept his head bowed, his chin nearly resting on his chest, but his fingers stopped tapping his temple. They hovered in the air for a moment, trembling, before he slowly lowered them to his knees. His breathing was ragged, shallow gasps lifting his chest. "Loud," he grated out. His voice was incredibly deep, a rusted baritone that sounded like it rarely got used. "Yeah," I agreed, remaining perfectly still. "It's too loud. There's too much cheap cologne. The lights are strobing slightly on the chandelier above the bar. It's a badly designed room." He went entirely still. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he tilted his head. He didn't look at my face. His gaze fixed firmly on my right shoulder, tracking the seam of my suit jacket. Up close, the alpha scent radiating from him was staggering. It wasn't the aggressive, weaponized dominance his father projected. It was heavy, ancient, and wildly untamed. Wet earth, cedar, and the sharp tang of ozone just before a lightning strike. But it was entirely internalized. He wasn't pushing it out, it was bleeding from him. "You smell like..." "Nothing," Gabriel muttered, his eyes darting from my shoulder to the floor, then to my knee. "Suppressants," I answered honestly. "I don't like the noise either, chemical or auditory." He processed that. His right hand started to tap against his knee again, a complex 5/4 rhythm. I watched his fingers. Without thinking, I started to tap my own fingers against my thigh in the exact same rhythm. I tap, 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 tap. Gabriel's eyes snapped to my hand. He watched my fingers mimic his. He sped the rhythm up. I matched him. He switched to a heavy downbeat with 2 quick offbeats. I followed flawlessly. The tension in his shoulders dropped by a fraction of an inch. "Do you want to leave the corner?" I asked softly. "No," he said immediately, his voice flat and defensive. "Okay, do you want to move?" He hesitated. His chest rose in a shaky breath. "Can't move. Too much gravity." I understood. The sensory input was pinning him down. If he moved, The friction of the room would tear him apart. I extended my hand. I didn't reach for him. I just held it out in the space between us, palm up, entirely stationary. An offer, not a demand. Focus on the hand, I said. Not the room, just the perimeter of my hand. Gabriel stared at my palm. He looked at the lines on my skin, the slight calluses from my day job at the docks, the pale blue veins at my wrist. He stared at it for a long, heavy minute. The ballroom behind me was entirely forgotten in my mind, but I could feel the ambient pressure of the crowd shifting. People were beginning to notice the Omega crouching in the dead zone. Slowly, Gabriel raised his hand. His movements were jerky, hesitant. He didn't take my hand in a traditional grip. Instead, he pressed his palm flat against mine. His skin was burning hot. The sheer physical density of him was startling. "Stand up with me," I murmured. "Keep the pressure on my hand." We rose together. He towered over me, easily 6'4" to my 5'10". When we were standing, the sheer mass of him blocked out the glare of the chandeliers. "Step," I said. I stepped backward. He followed, stepping forward. We were moving parallel, anchored only by the flat pressure of our palms. We weren't waltzing. We weren't doing anything that resembled the rigid, structured dances happening on the floor behind us. We were just pacing, shifting weight from one foot to the other in a slow, rhythmic circle inside the alcove. I began to hum. Just a low, resonant note in the back of my throat, a steady frequency to drown out the jarring screech of the string quartet. Gabriel's eyes remained fixed on our hands, but his breathing slowed. The frantic, jagged edges of his scent began to smooth out, the ozone fading into a deep, calming cedar. He shifted his grip, sliding his hand down so his fingers loosely wrapped around my wrist. The touch was incredibly gentle for a man with hands that could crush bone. We rotated in the shadows. Step, step, turn, step, step, turn. It was the most bizarre, grounded moment of my life. I was an Omega from a nothing family, swaying in a darkened corner with the heir to the cartel, acting as a human anchor. And for a second, it was peaceful. Then, the music stopped. It didn't just fade. It cut out abruptly with a horrible screech of a bow against strings. The ambient roar of conversation died with it, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying silence. I felt Gabriel flinch, his grip on my wrist tightening painfully. I turned my head. The crowd had parted. Standing at the edge of the velvet rope, flanked by 4 massive enforcers, was Don Carmine. His face was unreadable, a mask of carved stone, but his scent was a suffocating wave of pure, lethal fury. The entire room was holding its breath. My father was visible in the background, looking like he was about to vomit. The Don's cold, dead eyes locked onto me. "What?" Don Carmine rumbled, his voice echoing in the dead silence. "Are you doing to my son?" I froze. Every survival instinct hardwired into my Omega biology screamed at me to drop my eyes, bare my neck and beg for mercy. The Don's pheromones were a physical weight, designed to force submission from anyone lower on the food chain. My knees physically ached with the urge to hit the floor. But Gabriel was still holding my wrist. When the Don spoke, the deep, booming volume of his voice caused Gabriel to flinch violently. The alpha behind me shrank inward, his free hand flying up to cover his left ear, a low, distressed hum vibrating in his chest. If I dropped to the floor, I would break the physical anchor holding him together. I swallowed the bile in my throat, locked my knees, and looked Don Carmine directly in his chest, avoiding eye contact, a deliberate show of non-aggression, but refusing to bow. "He was overwhelmed, sir." I kept my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The acoustics in this corner are poor. I was providing a focal point. One of the enforcers, a scarred brute named Vincent, took a step forward, his hand slipping inside his jacket. "You don't touch the boss's blood, you little rat." "Vincent!" The Don's voice was a soft crack of a whip. Vincent stopped dead. Carmine took a step into the alcove. His eyes flicked from my face to where Gabriel's hand was wrapped around my wrist. For a fraction of a second, something passed over the old man's face. Not anger, confusion. A deep, profound lack of comprehension. "Gabriel," the Don said, his tone softening only marginally. "Let him go." Gabriel didn't move. His breathing was growing ragged again. The low hum in his chest pitched higher. He didn't look at his father. He stared stubbornly at my wrist. Gabriel, Carmine repeated, the alpha command bleeding into his tone, heavy and unavoidable. Gabriel's fingers spasmed. He let go of my wrist as if I had burned him, taking 2 rapid steps back until his shoulders hit the velvet-lined wall. He curled his arms around his torso, rocking back and forth on his heels, his eyes squeezed shut. The cedar scent vanished, instantly replaced by the acrid stench of panic. I felt a sudden, irrational spike of anger. You're hurting him. I wanted to scream at the Don. Your presence is hurting him. But I said nothing. I was a Rossi. I wanted to live to see tomorrow. Carmine stared at his son for a long, agonizing moment. The disappointment in the room was palpable, radiating from the sycophants watching from a safe distance. The Don's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze back to me. Get out of my sight, he said quietly. I didn't need to be told twice. I bowed my head, turned on my heel, and walked away. I didn't look back, even though the urge to check on Gabriel was a physical itch under my skin. I found my father near the exit, grabbed him by the elbow, and practically dragged him out of the hotel. We didn't speak on the ride home. We didn't speak the next day. I went to work at the docks, checking manifests and tallying shipments, waiting for the inevitable black SUV to pull up and put a bullet in the back of my head for overstepping. In the Mafia, you don't humiliate the Don by exposing his son's vulnerabilities. Even if you were trying to help. 3 days passed. The paranoia was exhausting. My sleep was fractured, haunted by the memory of a dark corner and the phantom weight of a heavy hand on my wrist. On the 4th evening, the knock came. I was in my cramped 3rd-floor apartment, eating cold noodles out of a takeout container. The knock wasn't frantic. It was 3 heavy, measured thuds that rattled the cheap wood of my door. I closed my eyes, let out a long breath, and walked to the door. I opened it. It wasn't Vincent. It was a man I recognized as Lucas, one of the Don's most trusted lieutenants. An older beta with graying temples and a tailored suit that cost more than my life. Elias Rossi, Lucas said smoothly. Not a question, but a confirmation. Grab a jacket. Am I coming back? I asked, my voice impressively devoid of the terror seizing my chest. Lucas offered a tight, humorless smile. That depends entirely on how the next hour goes. Let's go. The ride to the Carmine estate was a masterclass in silent intimidation. The estate was located outside the city, a sprawling fortress of high stone walls and wrought iron gates. I was patted down, stripped of my phone, and escorted through endless marble-floored hallways that echoed far too loudly. I was led into a massive office. The air smelled of expensive leather, cigar smoke, and heavy, oppressive power. Don Carmine sat behind a mahogany desk the size of a small boat. Lucas closed the door quietly behind me, leaving me alone with the man who owned the city. Sit, Carmine commanded. I sat in one of the leather armchairs opposite the desk. I kept my posture straight, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. The Don didn't speak immediately. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, took a sip, and studied me. His eyes were cold, calculating. You're Marco Rossi's boy, Carmine finally said. Your family handles the Southport extortions. Low yield, no ambition. We prefer stability, sir, I replied carefully. Carmine snorted. Stability, right. He leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the desk. Let me tell you about stability, Elias. My empire relies on it. It relies on a clear line of succession. It relies on strength. He paused, a muscle ticking in his jaw. My son, Carmine said, the words dragging out of him like heavy stones, has not slept in 3 days. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but my heart skipped a beat. He locks himself in his wing, the Don continued, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. He refuses to eat. He paces the floor until his feet bleed. My doctors can't get near him. If they try, he breaks their bones. The only thing he does is sit in front of his monitors, replaying the security footage from the hotel ballroom. Carmine picked up a remote from his desk and pressed a button. A large flat-screen TV mounted on the wall clicked on. It was silent, grainy footage from the gala. It was zoomed in on the dark alcove. It showed me stepping past the velvet rope. It showed me crouching down, tapping my fingers. It showed Gabriel mimicking the motion. It showed us standing, rotating in that strange parallel orbit, his hand on my wrist. The footage looped, it started over, He watches it on a loop, Carmine said, staring at the screen with a mixture of resentment and exhaustion. For 3 days. When I asked him what he wanted, he pointed at the screen. He pointed at you. The Don turned his terrifying gaze back to me. I don't understand him, Carmine admitted, a rare, startling moment of vulnerability slipping through the alpha armor. I never have. The world is too loud for him, and my world is nothing but noise. I thought you were mocking him at the gala. I was prepared to have you gutted and dumped in the bay. I wasn't mocking him, I said quietly. I was helping him regulate. Regulate! Carmine spat the word like it was poison. Psychiatric bullshit. He's an alpha. He should be leading men, not hiding from lights. The Don rubbed his face wearily. But he is my blood, and he is breaking apart. So, Carmine leaned back, the vulnerability vanishing, replaced instantly by the ruthless mob boss. You are going to go into his wing, the Don ordered. You are going to do whatever it is you did at the hotel. You will calm him down. If you succeed, your father's territory on the docks doubles tomorrow. If you fail, or if you agitate him further, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Lucas opened the office door. This way, kid. I stood up on shaking legs. I wasn't being executed. I was being used as a human pacifier for a volatile, deeply traumatized alpha who could snap my neck by accident. I followed Lucas out of the office, down a separate corridor, until we reached a set of heavy, soundproofed double doors. Lucas unlocked them with a keycard, but didn't open them. He's in there, Lucas muttered. Good luck. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the absolute silence of Gabriel's world. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, sealing with a pneumatic hiss that entirely severed the wing from the rest of the estate. The silence hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't the quiet of a deserted street or an empty room. It was an engineered, absolute deadness. The walls were lined with thick acoustic paneling, dyed a muted charcoal. The lighting was dialed down to a dull amber glow coming from recessed floor strips, and the room was utterly destroyed. A massive oak desk had been overturned, its heavy legs splintered. 3 large computer monitors lay shattered on the thick carpet, spiderwebs of cracked glass reflecting the low light. Books, ledgers, and files were scattered like snow. In the far corner, wedged between a heavy leather sofa and the wall, was Gabriel. He had stripped down to a plain grey t-shirt and loose sweatpants. He was sitting with his knees pulled tightly to his chest, arms wrapped around his shins, burying his face in his knees. The scent in the room was a suffocating fog of burnt cedar and sour adrenaline. He was rocking, much faster than he had been at the gala, his heels digging harshly into the carpet. He was humming. It was a jagged, broken sound, a low vocal stim meant to drown out the echoes in his own skull, but it was failing. I stood by the door for a long time. I let my own heart rate settle. I consciously pushed down the Omega instinct that urged me to flee from a volatile, distressed alpha. I forced my breathing into a slow, deliberate rhythm. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. I stepped forward. I made sure my shoes scuffed slightly against the carpet. I didn't want to surprise him. Gabriel's humming hitched. His rocking stuttered. He didn't look up, but his shoulders went rigid. He knew someone was there. I stopped a solid 10 feet away. I sat down cross-legged on the floor, right in the middle of the debris. I picked up a broken piece of plastic from one of the shattered monitors. I tapped it against the floor. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, steady, unremarkable rhythm. 60 beats per minute. A resting heart rate. I didn't speak. I just kept tapping. The silence of the room swallowed the sound, but the vibration traveled through the floorboards. 5 minutes passed. My wrists started to ache. Gabriel's manic rocking began to slow. The jagged hum in his throat smoothed out, aligning with the rhythm of the plastic hitting the floor. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by deep, bruised exhaustion. He looked at me, then immediately averted his gaze, focusing on the piece of plastic in my hand. The light on the 3rd monitor, Gabriel rasped. His voice was shredded, completely raw. It was flickering, a micro stutter. 40 hertz. It wouldn't stop. So you broke it, I said flatly. I broke all of them. The sound of the glass breaking was uniform, predictable. It drowned out the flicker. Makes sense to me. I tossed the plastic aside. I didn't ask if he was okay. I didn't tell him to calm down. I shifted my position, stretching my legs out, and looked at the overturned desk. "Your father said you haven't slept in 3 days," I said, keeping my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. Gabriel shifted, pressing his back harder against the wall. When I close my eyes, the ballroom replays, the noise, the overlapping voices, the cologne. I can map the exact decibel level of every conversation in that room. It won't turn off. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a long finger at me. "But you turned off." "I took you out of the current." "Parallel," he muttered, his fingers twitching in the air, tracing an invisible line. "You aligned the variables. Do you want me to do it again?" He hesitated. The alpha in him, the biology that demanded autonomy and control, fought against the desperate exhaustion of his nervous system. But his scent was shifting. The sour adrenaline was fading, leaving behind that heavy, ancient smell of wet earth and ozone. He gave a sharp single nod. I didn't offer my hand this time. I crawled forward, navigating the broken glass until I was sitting 3 feet away from him. I leaned my back against the same wall he was sitting against. We were shoulder to shoulder, separated by a gap of air. "Breathe with me," I said, looking straight ahead at the ruined room. I exaggerated my breaths, making my chest rise and fall visibly. I could feel the heat radiating off him. Slowly, I felt him try to match my rhythm. It took time. His lungs would hitch, his breath catching on a phantom panic. But I just kept the pace steady. After 20 minutes, the gap between us closed. He didn't initiate it, and neither did I. He sort of listed sideways, his exhaustion finally overpowering his tension, until his heavy shoulder rested solidly against mine. The physical pressure was immense. He was a brick wall of muscle and bone. But the moment our shoulders connected, his breathing leveled out entirely. "Elias," he mumbled. It was the first time he had used my name. "Yeah, it's quiet now." 10 minutes later, he was asleep, his head slumping heavily against my shoulder. I didn't move. I sat on the floor of the soundproof room, staring at the shattered glass, and let the dawn sun sleep. My father's territory on the Southport doubled the next morning. I didn't go back to the docks. I received a black envelope containing a weekly salary that made my father's annual extortion profits look like pocket change. My official title on the Carmine payroll was vague, logistics consultant, but everyone in the syndicate knew what I really was. I was the leash. For the next 2 months, my life shrank to the dimensions of Gabriel's wing. I learned the rules of his existence quickly. No overhead lighting, no synthetic fabrics. Food had to be separated on the plate, textures strictly managed, but most importantly, I learned what Gabriel actually did for the cartel. He wasn't just a defective heir hidden away in a padded room. He was the engine. Once the room was cleaned and new, flicker-free monitors were installed, I watched him work. Gabriel possessed a terrifying, almost mechanical intellect for patterns. The Carmine family moved millions of dollars in illicit goods, drugs, and laundered cash across 3 states. Gabriel ran all of it. He could look at a shipping manifest and spot a discrepancy in the weight of a container that indicated a skimming operation. He tracked the patrol routes of Coast Guard vessels, calculating intersecting variables in his head to find 10-minute blind spots for drops. He processed raw data with a relentless, brutal efficiency. His brain was a supercomputer, but a supercomputer overheats without a cooling system. That was my job. We didn't talk much at first. I sat in a heavy armchair in the corner of his office while he worked. I read books. I played solitaire. I existed simply to provide a baseline reality. When he started to escalate, when his fingers tapped too fast, when he started pulling at his hair, when the scent of ozone spiked sharply in the room, I would intervene. Sometimes it was just laying a heavy weighted canvas blanket over his shoulders. The deep pressure calmed his nervous system instantly. Other times, I would tap out complex rhythms on the desk for him to mimic, dragging his focus away from the overwhelming data and back into his body. "You're tracking 50 trucks, 3 cargo ships, and the entire city's police dispatch," I told him one Tuesday, handing him a mug of lukewarm, plain black tea. "No wonder you crack." Gabriel took the mug, keeping his eyes on a sprawling spreadsheet. "The numbers are clean. They don't have intent. They just exist. It's the physical execution that introduces chaos." "People introduce chaos." "Yes." He took a sip, set the mug down perfectly in the center of a coaster. My father thinks I am a coward because I do not enjoy breaking men's fingers in a warehouse. Are you? He stopped typing. He turned his chair slightly, his dark eyes fixing on my collarbone. He still struggled with eye contact, but he no longer flinched when I spoke. I broke a man's jaw in 3 places when I was 19, Gabriel said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. He touched the back of my neck at a meeting. My response was not anger. It was an overwhelming biological imperative to remove the sensory threat. It was inefficient. Violence is loud. It is messy. I prefer the numbers. You're not a coward, I said quietly. You're just playing a different game. He processed that, his eyes tracking the line of my jaw. Your suppressants are wearing off. I stiffened. I had missed my scheduled injection by 2 days. I thought the thick layers of my clothes and the heavy air scrubbers in the room had masked it. I'll get a refill tonight, I said sharply, suddenly hyper-aware of my Omega status in a locked room with an alpha. Gabriel tilted his head. You smell like cold brass and ink. He paused. It is not unpleasant. It is organized. He turned back to his monitors. He didn't push. He didn't demand submission or assert dominance. He simply acknowledged a data point and moved on. I sat back in my chair, staring at the broad line of his back. I was supposed to be a cynical opportunist, milking a cartel for a massive paycheck by babysitting a broken mobster. But as I watched him work, watching the slight sway of his shoulders, I realized the terrifying truth. I felt safer in this soundproof room with Gabriel Carmine than I ever had in the real world. The real world, however, has a nasty habit of breaking down doors. It happened on a Thursday in late November. The compound was typically quiet, the heavy winter rain drowning out the ambient noise of the city in the distance. Gabriel was hyperfixated on a complex money laundering route through a series of shell companies in Panama. I was dozing in the armchair, the rhythmic clicking of his mechanical keyboard lulling me to sleep. Then the floor vibrated. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was a violent, jarring shockwave that rattled the teeth in my skull. A split second later, a muffled, concussive boom echoed through the acoustic paneling of the walls. The estate's perimeter had been breached. Instantly, the emergency protocols activated. The amber lights in the room snapped off, replaced by a strobing, blinding red alarm light. A klaxon began to scream, a high-pitched, rhythmic wail designed to pierce through concrete. Gabriel screamed. It was a guttural, tearing sound of absolute agony. He ripped the keyboard from the desk and hurled it at the wall. He clamped his hands over his ears, dropping to his knees on the floor, his entire body convulsing. The klaxon was a physical assault. The strobing red light was a knife in his eyes. I sprang from the chair. "Gabriel!" I shouted, but my voice was completely lost in the blaring alarm. I scrambled across the floor, grabbing the heavy weighted blanket from the sofa. The Moretti family. It had to be the Morettis. The cartel war that had been brewing in the streets had finally reached the Don's front door. I threw myself over Gabriel, wrapping the heavy blanket around his head and shoulders, trying to muffle the sound and block the strobing light. He thrashed wildly. A rogue elbow caught me in the ribs with enough force to crack bone. I grunted, tasting blood, but I refused to let go. I pinned him down, using my entire body weight to press the blanket over his ears. "Listen to me," I yelled against his shoulder. "Focus on the pressure, just the pressure." He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under me. The scent of ozone and raw primal panic was suffocating. Through the floor, I could feel the rhythmic thud of automatic gunfire echoing from the lower levels of the house. They were inside. "Can't!" Gabriel gasped, his voice breaking. "Shattering. The noise. It's tearing me apart. I have you. I'm right here." I grabbed his wrists, pulling his hands away from his ears and pressing them flat against my chest. Feel my heartbeat. Match it. My heart was hammering like a jackhammer, but it was a biological rhythm, not a synthetic siren. Gabriel's wide, terrified eyes found mine in the strobing red light. He dug his fingers into my shirt. The heavy double doors of the wing blew inward with a deafening crash. Wood splintered across the room. 3 men in tactical gear stepped through the dust, assault rifles raised. The Moretti hit squad. They bypassed the Don to cut the head off the snake by taking out the air. "Got him!" the lead man barked, raising his rifle, aiming directly at the tangled mass of blankets on the floor. I threw myself bodily over Gabriel, instinctively trying to shield him. But Gabriel didn't freeze. The sensory overload that had paralyzed him shattered, replaced by a sudden, terrifying clarity. The threat was no longer an abstract noise. It was physical, present, and it was aiming a gun at his anchor. Gabriel moved with a violent, explosive speed that defied his massive frame. He didn't stand up. He swept his leg out in a brutal arc from the floor, catching the lead gunman behind the knees. The man went down hard. Before he hit the carpet, Gabriel's hand lashed out, gripping the barrel of the rifle and wrenching it upward. The gun fired, a deafening burst of rounds chewing into the ceiling. The other two gunmen opened fire, but Gabriel was already moving. He was calculating angles, spatial geometry, and kinetic force in real time. He used the falling man as a shield, letting the first volley of bullets hit the Kevlar vest of the Moretti soldier. Then Gabriel was on them. He didn't roar. He didn't project alpha dominance. He fought with an eerie, clinical silence, completely detached from the chaos around him. He stepped inside the guard of the second man, bypassing the rifle entirely, and drove the heel of his palm upward into the man's chin. The sound of the neck snapping was audible even over the klaxon. The third man hesitated, stepping back to adjust his aim. It was a fatal mistake. Gabriel closed the distance, grabbed the man by his tactical vest, and hurled him with terrifying force backward. The man smashed through the reinforced glass of the interior office door, collapsing in a heap of blood and shattered glass. In less than 10 seconds, the immediate threat was neutralized. Gabriel stood in the center of the ruined room. The red light strobed over his face. He looked at the bodies on the floor, his chest heaving, his hands coated in blood. The klaxon was still screaming. Gabriel's shoulders suddenly hunched. The clinical killer vanished, replaced instantly by the overwhelmed, drowning man. His hands flew back to his ears, a broken sob tearing from his throat. I didn't care about the gunfire echoing from the halls. I ignored the dead men. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the heavy blanket and ran to him. I threw the blanket over his head, wrapping my arms tight around his torso, burying my face in his chest. "I've got you!" I yelled over the siren, squeezing him as tightly as I could. "The variable's locked. You're safe. We're parallel." Gabriel dropped to his knees, pulling me down with him. He wrapped his massive, bloodied arms around me, burying his face in my neck, inhaling the scent of cold brass and ink like it was oxygen. He shook violently against me, but he didn't pull away. In the blood-soaked ruins of his sanctuary, we stayed perfectly still, anchored entirely to each other. The klaxon finally cut out. It didn't fade. It was killed at the source, leaving a ringing, heavy silence in its wake. The strobing red light switched to a dim, steady emergency backup glow. The sudden lack of sensory assault left my ears ringing and my stomach rolling. Beneath me, Gabriel was completely rigid. His fingers were locked into the fabric of my shirt, his breathing jagged and wet. The blood from his hands was soaking through my clothes, hot and sticky against my ribs, but I didn't pull away. I kept my arms wrapped tightly around his chest, maintaining the deep, even pressure of the weighted blanket. Footsteps thundered in the hallway, heavy boots crunching over splintered wood and shattered glass. "Clear the corridor," a voice barked. I recognized Lucas's rough baritone. A second later, the ruined doorway was filled with men. Flashlights cut through the dust, sweeping over the 3 dead Moretti hitmen, the broken monitors, and finally settling on us in the corner. "Lower the lights!" I snapped, my voice harsh and raspy. "Turn them to the floor, now!" For a second, the men hesitated. They were cartel enforcers, hard men wired to respond to dominance and violence, and I was just an Omega sitting in a pool of blood. But then Don Carmine stepped through the doorway. He was bleeding from a graze on his cheek, his suit jacket torn, radiating a thick, suffocating wave of alpha fury that smelled like burning copper. He took in the scene. He looked at the 3 dead men who were heavily armed and armored, reduced to broken meat on his son's floor. Then he looked at Gabriel, trembling under a blanket in my arms. "Do as he says," Carmine ordered softly. The flashlights dipped immediately, painting the floor in pale, scattered circles. Carmine walked slowly into the room, stepping over the man with the snapped neck. He stopped a few feet away from us. The heavy copper scent of his adrenaline was spiking, filling the dead air of the room. Gabriel whined, a low, pained vibration deep in his chest. He pressed his face harder into my shoulder, trying to escape his father's pheromones. "Back up," I told the Don. I didn't look at his face. I kept my eyes on Gabriel's bloodied hands. Carmine's jaw tightened. "I need to know he is uninjured. We are at war, Elias. The estate is compromised." "He's physically fine," I said, my tone flat, stripping away any deference. "But you are suffocating him. Your scent is too loud. The room is a wreck. Back up, give him 10 feet, and stop projecting." Lucas shifted uncomfortably by the door, his hand resting on his holster. "You simply didn't speak to the head of the Carmine family that way." But the Don didn't order my execution. He looked at the tactical rifle bent at an awkward angle on the floor, then back to his son. He took 3 deliberate steps backward. He forced his breathing to slow, consciously reining in the aggressive pheromones. "The Morettis pushed all their chips to the center of the table," Carmine said, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. "They hit 3 of our warehouses simultaneously. This was a decapitation strike. We need to move to the underground bunker, now." I nodded. I leaned my head down, pressing my cheek against the crown of Gabriel's head. "Gabriel," I murmured, dropping my voice to that steady, flat register. "The immediate threat is neutralized. We are going to stand up. We are going to walk out of this room. The hallway will be bright, but I will cover your eyes. We are moving to a smaller, quieter room. Understood?" Gabriel didn't answer verbally. He just gave a small, jerky nod against my collarbone. I unwrapped myself from him, taking his hands. They were shaking violently. I stood up, pulling him with me. He kept his eyes squeezed shut. I draped the heavy canvas blanket over his head and shoulders like a cowl, pulling the edges forward to act as blinders. I placed my hand flat against the center of his back, guiding him forward. We walked right past the Don. Gabriel didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge his father. He just kept his hand firmly clamped over my wrist, letting me navigate the wreckage. As we passed through the shattered doorway, I heard Carmine speak to Lucas in a low, gravelly whisper. "I thought he was broken," the Don muttered, staring at the carnage his son had wrought in under 10 seconds. "He's not broken, boss," Lucas replied quietly. "He's just built for a different kind of war." The bunker was a concrete vault, buried 40 feet beneath the estate. It was designed for nuclear fallout, which meant it possessed 2 things Gabriel desperately needed: absolute silence and perfect climate control. The air scrubbers hummed at a low, consistent frequency. The lights were industrial, but I unscrewed half the bulbs the moment we arrived, leaving the room in a manageable, dim twilight. For the first 24 hours, Gabriel didn't speak. He sat on a military cot, rocking rhythmically, staring at his hands. I brought him wet towels to clean the dried blood off his skin. I fed him plain, dry toast. I sat beside him and tapped out Fibonacci sequences on my knee until his breathing matched the math. On the second day, they brought the servers down. The cartel war above ground was turning into a bloodbath. The Morettis had the numbers, striking the Carmine supply lines with brutal efficiency. The Don was losing ground. He needed his logistics engine. They set up a bank of monitors on a steel table. Gabriel sat down in front of them, wrapped in the heavy canvas blanket. What followed was the most terrifying display of intellect I had ever witnessed. Gabriel didn't just track the Moretti family's movements. He deconstructed their entire existence. He pulled municipal traffic data, property records, offshore bank routing numbers, and satellite weather patterns. He saw the spaces between the data. "The Moretti shipments are delayed by exactly 4 minutes at the south side docks," Gabriel muttered, his eyes darting across 3 screens simultaneously. His voice was hoarse, mechanical. "They are rerouting through a blind spot in the Port Authority's camera grid. But the weight of the trucks exiting the grid is 3% lighter than when they enter." I sat in a folding chair beside him, peeling an apple. "What does that mean?" "They are dropping inventory in the blind spot. There is a warehouse on Pier 42 that hasn't reported utility usage in 6 months, yet the thermal imaging shows a heat signature consistent with human habitation. That is their staging ground." He printed a single sheet of paper with coordinates and handed it to Lucas, who was waiting by the steel door. 3 hours later, Pier 42 burned to the waterline, taking out 20 Moretti enforcers and $1 million in untraceable weapons. Gabriel did this for 4 days straight. He dismantled a century-old Mafia empire with a keyboard and a quiet, terrible rage. Every time the numbers overwhelmed him, every time the phantom echoes of the gunfight crept into his peripheral vision, I was there. I was the anchor. I kept the room perfectly temperate. I intercepted the Don's frantic demands, translating the violent, high-stakes pressure of the cartel into calm, digestible variables for Gabriel. But my own biology was becoming a liability. By the 5th day in the bunker, my suppressants were completely out of my system. The synthetic blocker that kept my omega scent neutral was gone. I began to smell like what I was, an unbonded omega, trapped in a confined space, surrounded by high-stress alpha pheromones. My scent, usually a faint hint of ink and brass, bloomed into something sharp, sweet, and desperately anxious. My body temperature spiked. My skin felt too tight. Every time Gabriel shifted in his chair, my pulse hammered in my throat. The instinct to submit, to curl into a corner and bare my neck to the massive alpha in the room, was a physical weight crushing my lungs. I retreated to the far corner of the bunker, wrapping my arms around my knees, trying to breathe through my mouth so I wouldn't smell him. Gabriel stopped typing. The rhythmic clatter of the keyboard ceased. The silence in the bunker felt suddenly dangerous. He turned his chair slowly. His dark eyes locked onto me in the shadows. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the tense line of my shoulders. He stood up. Panic flared in my chest. He was an alpha. He had just spent 4 days orchestrating mass murder. The biological drive to claim an overheating omega in his territory would be overwhelming. I pressed my back hard against the concrete wall, my breathing going shallow. Gabriel walked across the room. He didn't loom over me. He stopped 3 feet away, just outside my personal space, and sat down on the concrete floor. He didn't project dominance. He didn't flood the room with heavy, commanding pheromones. Instead, he pulled his scent back entirely, wrapping it tightly inside himself, leaving the air clear. "You are loud," Gabriel said quietly. His voice was rough, but devoid of the mechanical detachment he used for the data. Chemically loud, it is erratic, spiking. "I'm sorry," I managed to choke out, digging my fingernails into my palms. "The suppressants wore off. I can't control it. Just ignore me. Go back to the screens." "I cannot ignore a misaligned variable," he replied. He reached out. I flinched, bracing for a harsh grip on my jaw or my neck. Instead, Gabriel placed his large, heavy hands flat over my ears. The ambient hum of the air scrubbers vanished. The sound of my own ragged breathing was muffled. The deep, warm pressure of his palms against the sides of my head was intensely grounding. "Your nervous system is fraying," Gabriel murmured, his voice vibrating through his hands into my skull. "The biological input is too high. Close your eyes. Reduce the data." I closed my eyes. "Focus on the pressure," he instructed, repeating the exact words I had used on him during the attack. He didn't try to kiss me. He didn't try to claim me. He simply sat on the cold concrete floor, holding my head between his hands, applying a firm, steady pressure that told my screaming biology that it was safe. That the alpha in the room was not a threat, but a wall. Slowly, the frantic, sweet spike of my scent leveled out. My heart rate dropped. The terrible heat in my skin faded into a manageable warmth. We sat like that for an hour. 2 men in a concrete box, trading the burden of their overloaded senses. "Better," he noted, feeling the tension bleed out of my neck. "Yeah," I breathed out. "Thank you." He lowered his hands, letting them rest on his knees. He looked at my hands, studying the white knuckles. "You do not need chemicals to exist in this room, Elias," Gabriel said, his tone entirely factual. "I have mapped your scent. I have categorized it. It is not chaos. It is you. You are permitted to occupy space here." It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a statement of profound logistical intimacy. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to me. The war ended 2 weeks later. It didn't end with a grand shootout or a cinematic explosion. It ended with the sudden, catastrophic financial collapse of the Moretti organization. Gabriel had traced their offshore accounts and quietly handed the routing numbers over to a rival cartel down south, who bled the Morettis dry overnight. Without money, the Moretti enforcers scattered. The head of the family was found dead in his car, courtesy of his own unpaid bodyguards. The Carmine family had won, But the victory cost them the old regime. Don Carmine had suffered a massive stroke on the 9th day of the bunker siege, brought on by the immense stress and the blood pressure spike from his superficial gunshot wound. He lived, but the right side of his body was paralyzed. He could no longer project the booming, terrifying alpha presence required to hold the East Coast together. The throne was empty. A month after we emerged from the bunker, the heads of the 5 remaining families arrived at the Carmine estate to acknowledge the new Don. They expected weakness. They expected a fractured syndicate led by a defective heir who couldn't look a man in the eye. They came wearing sharp suits and heavy cologne, leaking aggressive pheromones, ready to carve up the Carmine territory like vultures. They were brought to the West Wing. The heavy soundproof doors had been replaced with reinforced steel. The capos were ushered into the massive office. The overhead lights were entirely off. The only illumination came from the soft amber floor strips and the glow of 4 large monitors resting on a pristine oak desk. The air was perfectly still. The temperature was exactly 68 degrees. Gabriel sat behind the desk. He wore a dark, tailored suit, but no tie. The top button was undone. He wasn't rocking. He was perfectly still, his massive frame dominating the space simply by existing within it. I stood 2 feet to his right, leaning casually against a filing cabinet, a tablet in my hand. The 5 capos stopped in the center of the room. They looked confused, irritated by the dim lighting, immediately trying to flood the room with dominance. Gabriel didn't react. He didn't try to match their sense. He just looked at a spot on the desk directly in front of him. "You're breathing too heavily, Sal," Gabriel said. His voice was that rusted, deep baritone, echoing slightly in the acoustic paneling. It wasn't a shout. It was a cold, hard fact. Sal, an older alpha from the north side, scowled. "What kind of circus is this, Gabriel? We came to talk business, not sit in the dark." "Your margin on the construction rackets dropped 4% this quarter," Gabriel continued, completely ignoring the insult. He tapped a key on his keyboard. A spreadsheet illuminated the largest monitor. "You lost 3 foremen to union disputes. You attempted to cover the deficit by skimming from the concrete suppliers." Sal went completely pale. The aggressive pheromones vanished, instantly replaced by the sharp tang of fear. Gabriel finally looked up. He didn't look Sal in the eye. He looked at the man's throat. "If you steal from this family again," Gabriel said, his tone devoid of any anger, treating the threat like a simple mathematical equation, "I will not send men with guns. I will route your shell companies to the federal authorities, and you will die in a maximum security prison." The silence in the room was absolute. The capos realized all at once that they weren't dealing with a man who played by the old rules of respect and posturing. They were dealing with a machine that held all their strings, perfectly insulated in a dark room. One by one, the capos nodded. They didn't kiss the ring. Gabriel despised unexpected physical contact anyway, but they pledged their shipments, their roots, and their loyalty. When the last man filed out, the heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing the room. Gabriel exhaled a long, slow breath. He reached up, rubbing the heels of his hands against his eye sockets. The rigid posture melted, his broad shoulders slumping forward. "They wear too much cologne," he muttered. "We can mandate a scent-free dress code for the next meeting," I said, setting the tablet down. Gabriel dropped his hands. He turned his chair slightly toward me. The heavy, ancient scent of cedar and rain filled the room. Not a projection of power, just a settling of his own biology. He held out his hand, palm up, hovering in the space between us. I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward and pressed my palm flat against his. His skin was warm, the calluses familiar. We stood there in the quiet amber light, 2 parallel lines in a world built on chaos. We didn't need to speak. We didn't need to force a dynamic. I tightened my fingers slightly, locking our hands together. Gabriel squeezed back. The room was perfectly silent, and for the first time in my life, it was enough. If this deeply grounded take on the Omegaverse grabbed you, hit that like button to let the algorithm know. We love exploring how real human vulnerability changes these classic tropes. Don't forget to share this with your friends who love a gritty, unconventional Mafia romance, and subscribe to the channel with the bell icon turned on so you never miss our upcoming dark romance stories. What was your favorite moment between Elias and Gabriel? Drop a comment down below. We read every single one.